I'll just, before we kind of dive in, I'll give you a little bit of background as to why the two of us are kind of sitting here chatting about stuff. And we have no plan, by the way. It'll just be, just follow us down the rabbit hole. And we'll also have a little bit of time at the end for questions as well, if you want to make it a little interactive. But essentially, we were just trying to figure it out. It's probably about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Here in LA, although we're both Brits. And like most sort of people find me, it's normally because they've got something going on that they need some help with, like a back issue. That was why James came along to see me first of all, and then our sessions just became these kind of great philosophical discussions on random topics, and we just discovered that we both sort of had a thirst for kind of figuring out creativity, the artistic kind of realm. My sort of background is as a performing artist, but then I moved into what's called performing arts medicine. So it's kind of like sports medicine, but for artists. And so having been on the sort of performance end of things, I wanted to figure out the kind of science behind it. And I think there are some things that can be explained by science and other things that are best left to the ineffable when it comes to art. But we started having these chats, and I was doing quite a few talks at the time in performing arts medicine to medical professionals as well as artists and arts educators. And I think there was one time you were there, and I said, oh, I'm going to do this talk. And you said, whenever you do those talks, I'd really like to be there and like contribute. And I was like, seriously? Careful what you wish for. So we ended up doing quite a few kind of talks together, and it's great because obviously James is going to bring the lived experience of being an artist within the industry and all the sort of machinations of that and how that affects creativity, and then I can kind of bring the physiology, the psychology behind it, and help artists to really have a roadmap of how to understand the self, because there's a lot of dismissing of artists as, oh, they're just so dramatic and they're so, oh, they're up, they're down, they're,
or enabling,
yeah. And that, but when you understand why that is, and that there is often a biological basis for that, did you know there is a biological basis for creativity? It just helps you to kind of understand it and explain it and give you some kind of strategy to be able to handle those sort of ups and downs. So we titled this Tuning the Creative Self, because I think at the end of the day, the sort of what's underneath all of this is that if you have a good sense of self, you can navigate the industry, the creative mind a lot better than if you're still wandering yourself. So I thought I'd kind of open up with that. James, what's been your kind of experience? Obviously you began your career very quietly on your own. Nobody knew who you were, and then became prominent very quickly. And then you kind of had to grow up in the public eye. So how did that affect your creativity?
Well, I remember distinctly a time when the larger kind of impact of music sort of I didn't really have a sense of what that was, and also the attention, there was no attention on it, so there was just me and my friends, me playing my music to my friends, my parents, and obviously that's in some ways that I was desperate to prove myself, but I think there was a bliss in that, and obviously every artist talks about who if their music gets exposure, almost all of them talk about the pre and post exposure feeling. And for me, I was a cliche in a sense, where as soon as it got some exposure, the self-doubt, the things that probably existed before but were not yet exacerbated, became kind of deafening, and I wasn't really, I think there were voices around me that weren't particularly helpful when it comes to that, and I was probably not always having the healthiest conversations about how to recreate success, or how to recreate moments of success, or moments of things coming to fruition, whatever that may look like. But I think, I had a pretty fractured sense of self to start with, so I think that probably didn't help. And I don't think whether I'd become successful or not by whatever metric, I think I would have struggled with the behavioral norms, or the kind of like lifestyle of being an artist, when the rest of the world is operating in such a different way. I think I probably still would have struggled with the fact that I was living kind of off schedule. I was, staying up till 4 or 5 in the morning trying to get things done, because that was the time I felt inspired, and that was the time that kind of worked for me. And then most of the day was disappearing before I was, and I was becoming more and more kind of fragmented as a result. But I mean, this is kind of jumping in at the deep end of like what it was initially. And there were lots of great, there were lots of great moments of discovery. They just weren't really self-discovery. You know what I mean?
All right. And did you, was your, your ability to have creative output, at least, was that in a way some sort of catharsis? Was your ability to write and compose a means to journeying to the self?
I think in the moment, yes. But once that moment had passed, no. I think, I always say to other artists, like, who are maybe struggling with their mental balance, are we going to say? What are we saying? We don't like mental health. So, feeling good. And what I'd say would be always, music will make you feel better for about 5 minutes. While, if you're lucky enough to be having your greatest inspirational moment, or your kind of most divine download, then you'll feel great for a minute, and then you'll wake up the next morning and be back to exactly the same place you were before. So I think the work to kind of balance has to happen outside of music, to be honest. I'd like to say that music is the salve that heals all, but in my experience, it isn't. So
let's put that one on the on the back burner. So it kind of comes to that. What I'm hearing there is like this idea of that sense of self can often be sort of fleeting. It's like you grasp it in the moment, and then it's gone again. Mm-hmm. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that's always out of reach. Mm-hmm. And it sort of comes to this idea of personality, and that word, if you break that down, the sort of Latin origins, persona, per, through, sona, sound, actually comes from the wearing of the theatrical mask, right, from Greek tragedy, where you push the sound through the mask. So the personality is actually a mask that we put out there for approval. If any of you have heard of Gabor Mate and his works, he's a medical doctor who's also done a lot of work into the sort of psychology of human behavior. And he always says, we don't have personalities, we have coping strategies. And I just love that as a phrase. So what can often happen with artists, I don't know if this is your experience as well, is that you kind of create this persona so that you can cope and interact and be who you think people expect you to be.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But then you can end up buying your own press, and it comes back to this idea that if you don't have a felt sense, because the sense of self is a feeling, it's not a thought, it's a feeling inside. This is me, and I can keep that as my GPS coordinate. And I often use the sort of analogy that you can have this incredible goal of where you want to get to, you can have the best map in the world, but if you don't have a GPS coordinate of you, you ain't gonna get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I imagine that, you know, with the sort of prominence that you experience, that becomes even more, the gap between personality and self can become more divorced in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying it, I was thinking, I'm doing it now. I'm sitting here with my, you know, being all cool, trying to be cool.
6'6" frame in a garden chair.
Speaking slightly softly, slightly more softly than I always normally do. It's hard to, I mean, it's hard to say where that started, but I think my stage presence is way cooler than I actually am. I mean, what, like, not even in the same fucking hemisphere, stratosphere. And I think that coming to terms with that was like a big part of getting to know myself and actually understanding that when I'm doing that, when I'm on stage, I am connecting with something that I love. But while doing it, it's okay to go out on stage and be someone for other people. You know, like I don't think if I got up there and, you know, was my true self, that it would do much for them. I mean, it might be a nice insight, but I mean, what's the point? You know, it's like that is for them and this is for me. And I think what my friends see and what you guys will probably see more of, is who I actually am. And I think that, you know, with lots of you in this room, currently looking at me, my instinct is to become smaller and quieter. I don't know if that's being a tall man. I don't know, but that is my instinct, and to be cooler and to be less, kind of to stand out less and to kind of be less awkward in some way or whatever. You hold my, it's like when you get stoned and you're just going, I haven't moved my hand in half an hour, and everyone knows. It's it's like I'm breathing too heavily, and everyone can hear it. It's like that, and so I'm having those thoughts now, and actually, I think saying them out loud makes me feel better about those thoughts, and I think I think that's something you don't learn from being. By the way, I could probably speak way back here, couldn't I? You can hear me like this, right? It's just ego. It's just like trying to get in. No,
that kind of
yeah. I'm trying to give you my radio voice. No, but so I think it's what was I just saying? I think one thing I had to come to terms with was that if I was good at music, that couldn't be my whole fucking personality. And if I wasn't good at music suddenly because I had writer's block or I wasn't communicating effectively in that medium, or it's taking me a long time to finish music, or I don't want to go on tour because I'm too depressed or whatever the fuck, then I am still someone. And outside of that, there had to be something to live for. And I think that's the balance, I think, of being creative. Some in a way lies in making sure that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket just because that's kind of the way that we have to make money to survive, especially the money side. But for me, the creative side, I mean, anyone starts associating you with your art or your work or anything that you do creatively, it's very easy to start to enjoy that and start to think, and as soon as you're rewarded for it, it's kind of Pavlovian conditioning as to say, keep doing that, don't worry about this other stuff. And it was my experience that by focusing almost solely on the music, I completely lost my way in music. not just in music, but in my career. I wasn't able to do any promotion. I wasn't able to tour anymore. I wasn't really able to do anything. And, you know, by I mean, you were a huge part of that. It's, you know, finding the coherency is the word. In, you know, overall balance, I think that was a big part of feeling better and being able to kind of look at those moments from a distance and be able to kind of walk into a room and feel like an authentic self. And, you know, these are all buzzwords really, authentic self, you know, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, are you saying everything that you're thinking, just to a reasonable extent? Are you able to tune into your intuition despite the noise? Can you reduce the noise? And can you actually say you can be yourself with people you don't know, and even with people you do know? They are much more important to me than, I don't know, being able to make a beat. I mean, who gives a shit? It's like, so many people can do that. I mean, it's, you know, play some chords. Well, I mean, I love music, but there just had to come a point for me where it was like, okay, cool, there's another album. Okay, cool, there's another album. Yeah, okay, right, yeah, we got music. Everyone's making music. It's like, there's a lot of music out there. There really is a lot of music. I mean, it's been democratized to the point where the world could live without another album from me. And I just, you've really got to go, okay, well, if that does happen, you know, if AI figures out a way to, you know, endlessly blabber on about romance in its work, and it replaces me entirely, what would I have? Would I?
You're no longer cornering the market,
No.
blabbering about romance.
Do you know what I mean? What would I have? And I think that honestly is my goal now, is to make sure that side is kind of all intact.
Yeah, and it's that kind of, you know, wheel of life. You know, when I'm working with young artists, particularly, it's you know, that you have a wheel of life that has sort of friends, family, relationships, finance, romance, you know, all these things, and they should all be a different color.
Yeah.
But if all your pieces of pie on that wheel, finance, well, I make my money from my art. Friends, all my friends are musicians. Family, my family are all involved in my art. Leisure,
Right.
well, I'm always doing my art, so I don't have time for leisure, you know. And so, because I work with a lot of people when they are injured or unable to perform for whatever reason, one of the things I always say is, if I take this off the table for you, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if this was off the table tomorrow for whatever reason, who are you? You know, this is what you do. This is where we have this issue with being creative, is that it's not just what we do, right? There is a huge part of ourselves in it, but you have to also see it as that it is something that I do, and that I can be creative in many different ways. And it doesn't just have to be this one, you know, piece of pie. So that then you've got that balance, and that and I think that will also inform the art as well.
Absolutely. I was going to say that I don't listen to Kevin O'Leary very much, but there was one thing he said that I thought was interesting, which is that he won't hire someone, and this is in the corporate business world, whatever. He goes, I won't hire someone who works 7 days a week, but I will hire the guy who goes and plays golf on weekends. And I thought that was interesting, just because actually I found my own creative self being a lot more healthy when I implemented the weekend rule. It sounds really insane in some ways, because it's like, oh my God, a weekend, what a novel idea. But for me, I was just bleeding into I mean, it's just like a wash, you know, an ADHD wash of every day being just, well, I'll make music. I mean, it's my job, right? Make music every day. It actually didn't work for me in the end. And just generally. I mean, obviously we can talk about things that actually enhance your creativity as well. I think I wanted to first make the point of, yes, the overall balance is sometimes quite an easy, practical thing, as much as that was for me.
Kind of looking at, again, sort of, the more broader sense of self. I know, over the years that you've, really started to look more closely at health and different choices that you make on the sort of more physical side of things. Has that sort of affected, again, your kind of approach to?
Yeah. I remember seeing Coldplay on stage once, and I heard that we were backstage, and I heard that Coldplay were playing on another stage at the festival, and I heard that Chris Martin had this like very extensive like workout routine he did before shows, and I always thought, oh, what, why? Why? And now I know. Now I realise it was probably about 7 years ago. As I continued every unhealthy habit possible in my world, there he was, holding a direct mirror to all of that, and being immensely like healthy and going out and performing headline, and smashing it. So that was a sort of a lesson to me in a way. But yeah, I think the physical thing. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I don't work out, and I wanted to get to a point where I could just go on a walk once a day and be all right. I just don't believe in doing 2-3 hours of fucking exercise I just don't believe it. Why? Like, just muscle. Who cares? Like, I just don't have that thing. And I just wanted to address, because you can become addicted to anything. So if you're a lifelong addict, it's easy to just be like, okay, well, I'll trade in alcohol, I'll trade in whatever it is, sex, I'll trade in drugs for wellness. I'll trade it in for yoga, or I'll trade it in for something else. And you don't realize you're doing it, but it's very easy to do. And, I did a number of things therapy-wise that did genuinely help me. And I think they did get me further towards that, 45-minute walk a day mentality, laziness. Yeah, I think, I think because most of us artists come from quite a fractured place initially anyway. So we're always kind of playing catch up with the rest of the world. More sensitive, more easily overwhelmed, more prone to ADHD, probably slightly on the spectrum. There's a lot of things that, I don't know if that's the right word to say that, but you know what I'm saying? There's a lot of things that come with being an artist, and you'll find that in almost every artist. So I think as a producer, my job, I work with a lot of different artists, and my job is, I'd say it's 50% making music and then 50% providing a safe space for someone to be what they are, and some of it is, when they come in with not the right headspace or right mind frame, talking it out and figuring out what's going on. And having gone through a lot of that stuff myself, not everything, but my share, I think I'm now getting better and more qualified but it honestly does make me sometimes feel more like a therapist. And which is great, because that's really important. But excuse me, it's a holistic balance, isn't it? It's like there's a synergizing set of things you can do that all work together to make you feel better and to put you in a creatively successful mind frame. There isn't one thing. There's just not one thing. You have to really do a bit of everything, and that will, you'll find you'll find the thing that works for you. And one thing I used to do was I'd be like, well, EMDR therapy, eye movement, desensitization, repetition. That worked for me. So I'm going to fucking evangelically tell everyone that they should do it. Yeah, it did work for a lot of people, but also there were people who just came to me like, oh, I didn't like the therapist, or I didn't really resonate with this. And at the time, I think I was too stubborn and didn't really understand. And I was just like, they're not trying hard enough. You know, it's like they're not really taking it seriously, or they're not, you know. But it's actually a lot of things. Just not everything works for everyone, and so now just being able to suggest a broad range of things, or even trying a broad range of things myself. I think that's how you just slowly get that, you know, acclimatize. Or
it's actually a biological imperative to seek out diversity as well. It's like if you ate the same meal every day, you know, you'll get, I'm sick of this. That's the body going, you need more vitamins and minerals, you need variety in your diet. So we get forced out of a groove if we get too repetitive. When you were talking a bit about the sort of addictive tendencies that are part of the biology of creativity, like you say, you can kind of get hooked on something like, oh, this becomes almost like a superstition. I have to do this or I can't go on stage. You know, having been in, you know, mainly in theatre most of my life, you know, everybody had their sort of, you know, superstitions, and it's like, I've got to knock the table 3 times and turn around before I can go on the stage. You know, we all have our little kind of practices you have to do, and if you don't do it, you're terrified. I'm going to forget my lyrics tonight, you know. So there's that sort of balance between getting fixated on something and seeking diversity. And I think when you get too fixated, then you actually will experience a form of anxiety as the body's trying to push you out of that, and then people try and just quash the anxiety rather than seeking the diversity. So it's you know, it's a tricky business navigating the creative personality. And you kind of talked about this sort of sense of being fractured, and you know, there's a lot of research that says that, you know, a big part of creativity is born from particularly childhood adversity, you know. And it's not to say that everybody's had some huge trauma in their childhood, but just a sense of not quite feeling safe. Because if your world is completely safe, you need for nothing, you've got everything you need, then, you know, as infants, we're born with infinite connections. We tend to have this idea that when we grow as a child, we're actually growing in intelligence, we're creating more pathways. It's kind of the opposite. Aging is a form of forgetting and narrowing, right? So it's something called pruning in the neuronal system. You're born with all this connection, which is why you've got imagination and all these things, and then you're like, oh no, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, and you prune your little bonsai tree until it looks perfect to fit in this society, right? And if everything's safe in your world, then you kind of do that quite happily. But if there is sort of, you know, a degree of turbulence in your experience, then and what's in front of you is not tolerable, you'll retreat, you'll keep those pathways open because it's a place you can retreat to and kind of escape to. So creativity requires that we have this kind of divergent capacity in our brains, and that is often as a result of the fact that this world, if this is the reality, who knows, was not quite the comfortable place, right? So we retain the other.
I was going to ask you what you mentioned earlier that musicians, or sorry, just centered myself there. Artists in general they come from a, what was it I was going to ask? There's a biology to creativity. What is that, and why do we grow into that sort of physiology or that biology?
So it's that kind of nature versus nurture environment argument, if you like, of, you know, is it completely a product of your environment, or are you born innately creative? I would say that everybody is innately creative. We are creative beings, and creativity is not reserved for the arts by any means. But when you look at brain anatomy. So there's some research that was done looking at is there any are there any anatomical differences or structural differences in brain anatomy that are I wouldn't say necessarily cause creativity, but are predictive of it. And in that particular research, because you've got to start with the question, how do you define creativity, right? And
Which is if you've got a membership to Soho House.
of course,
Yeah.
or is it Neuhaus?
One of them, yeah. Neuhaus.
It's that argument. So there's this for this particular research, they defined creativity as the capacity for divergent thought. So you've got like 100 streams of thought. I'm sure any creators in the crowd will relate to this. It's like, oh, I've got this and I must do that, and the capacity to focus on a narrow task is quite hard. It's like, oh, right. So that's called divergent thought versus convergent thought, where you're able to focus very narrowly on something. And essentially, there's a part of our brain, it's called the thalamus, for those who like the nerdy stuff, that basically acts as a signal filter. So we're being bombarded with stimuli all the time, right? Noises, smells, that air conditioner came on. I'm like, ding, ding, ding.
I saw that.
Right.
I saw you go and completely lose your train of thought. I had the same exact thing. That's funny.
I triggered you there.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm this hyper awareness of everything around you, and the ability to kind of, in the face of all of that, to focus on a narrow task requires this filtering operation of the thalamus. And what's required for that is something called dopamine, which you might have heard of. It's kind of pop culture as the happy chemical, right? The reward chemical. You get a buzz from your dopamine, but it has many other functions in the body, one of which is to dial down the noise. So this thalamus can absorb the dopamine, and then our world gets narrower and we can focus on one thing. What was shown in this research is that those who are up the divergent end, the creative end of the spectrum, have fewer receptors for dopamine on the thalamus. So I would say it just means we're less able to filter the crazy, right? It's not that we don't have the dopamine, it's just we don't have the receptors to absorb it into the bit of the brain that makes things go quiet. So when you're hyper stimulated, it's just really hard to focus on one thing. So then you get dopamine hungry because you're like, I want it to go quiet. I want it to go quiet. So then you're going to reach for things that give you dopamine exogenously, right? You are dopamine hungry. So that could be the alcohol, the drugs, or just bar of chocolate, right? A hug, right? Physical contact. So lots of things give us dopamine hit. So that can also explain these, so-called addictive tendencies in creatives. It's just a dopamine hunger. But without this capacity for divergent thought, you couldn't be as creative as you are. So, it's this, everything's polarized, right? Positive, negative. I don't like positive and negative being described as good and bad. We tend to put judgments on these terms. A battery has a positive and negative charge. Both are required or it doesn't work, right? We have a North Pole and a South Pole. You don't say the North Pole's better than the South Pole. They're both required or we fly off the planet. So being able to visit these and have the elasticity, and again, it comes back to that initial idea of if you have a good GPS felt sense of self, you can go to these extremes, whether they're up, down, sideways, whatever, but always have that roadmap to get back to self, have that, I know where my anchor is, and then I can go from there. Without that, you're just floating.
That, I think, is the crux of it for me. I mean, I probably describe myself as dopamine starving. That, I think, when you told me that, I mean, among all of the ways I've tried to kind of center myself creatively, I mean, it's like we're all doing it differently, but I think we probably all, to some degree, struggle with the amount of new ways to be given that dopamine, whether it's, it's literally anything, any of the things I said, any of the addictions, any of the, whether it's fucking your phone or porn, like whatever it is, they all give you dopamine. And I think the addressing of that, I mean, I spoke to someone who told me that, you know, deficiencies in certain vitamins or certain things in your body can be responsible for a lack of dopamine. I found myself kind of going down a rabbit hole of how do I get this famed dopamine without these crazy fucking screens all everywhere. You know, sitting in a sports bar with my phone and like an iPad and the 3 screens showing sport. You know, it's like that is the ultimate kind of everything. It feels like is the ultimate diversion, and from actually feeling good. It's like a kind of false. It's like sugar. It's like a false economy. And I found myself turning to. For me, I mean, I've addressed it with medication. That's really helped. Not selling, you know, I'm not like a shill for medication here, but I wanted to do something that would actually just correct it just for a second so I could fucking think. Mm-hmm. And then they say medication is it's not necessarily the cure, but it's the stool, you know, you stand on to get to the light switch, you know. And I think that's helped, and I'm trying to find a way of now addressing it in the long term without being permanently on medication, although who knows? I mean, whatever works. And whatever works for you, you know, works, but it's definitely a huge thing. And I was finding as the phones were getting better, or well, better, I mean, more sophisticated, my music was getting worse. And there's a direct inverse correlation there. So that's, I think, you know, a huge part. I mean, I don't know if any of you, you know any intuitive people, or I think I might be talking to the right audience. But those kind of people, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but whether you believe in it or not, those kind of intuitive, you know, healers, fucking Reiki people, whatever, amazing people who actually do a lot of great work, who a lot of the time are disparaged by a lot of people. And I think that, you know, like I said to you, what works. You know, I come from England, where even the mention of energy might as well be met with, I mean, I think you're not allowed in the country.
That's why we live here now, right?
Right. So anyway, anytime I started talking holistically about diet or anything like that, I was, you know, even by my friends, I was just met with suspicion. But I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of those kinds of people who are very good at that kind of thing, or who are very dialed in, or even the great artists or the great, you know, whatever, they tend to stay in the sticks, or they tend to like not really have a phone. They don't use an iPhone, or they try and stay away from like Wi-Fi, and they try and, do you know what I mean? Like they're very particular about the things that we've come to.
Describing me, basically, just
yeah,
like...
just her. They're very particular about the things that we've come to consider normal now. And I think the phone, not just through, you know, it's not just, I don't know, radiation or whatever the fuck else is going on, but it's actually just this attention kind of absorbing device, and many others that we have in our home. They do guide you away from your intuition, I think. And I think that what we're experiencing as a society is a kind of disarray where it's hard to access our intuition. And what with the amount of things that can divert our attention. And I think that every generation has probably talked about this, whether it's back to the 60s with television's invented. God, the kids are, you know,
it's programming.
Well, whatever generation you'd speak to probably had their own version of this, but ours just seems like the worst, doesn't it? It does seem like the worst.
It's the most extreme. We've taken it to.
It seems like the most extreme, and I think it's like, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, back in those days it was all better. But it's like, and I'm only 34, so I shouldn't really be talking like that. But it's like, it just feels like that this thing this thing has just dominated my life in a way that it shouldn't fucking do. And it honestly destroys creativity. I mean, I think if this talk was just about put your fucking iPhone in the bin, it would be worth coming. If you actually took that away and just did that. I wish I could listen to my own advice. But yeah, these things, and that all comes back to what you're saying about the dopamine. So I think addressing if what artists are going through, if what artistic people are going through is a dopamine deficit, comparative to other people, then that's a huge issue for us. And so another question is how else, aside from medication or aside from things that may not be forever solutions, what do we do?
Yeah, because it's not just, that's just like a very reductionist look at, one element of the dopamine system. There's also issues with dopamine dysregulation. And normally there's a sort of it's a fluctuating thing. We get bursts of it and sort of, peaks and troughs. But with creatives, we tend to have big peak and then a big trough and a big peak and a big trough. So for me, it's more about understanding that. It's like that's just how it is. So how do we work with that? And actually, there's some really interesting research done into some of the great composers of the sort of 18th, 19th century. Who were known to suffer with melancholic depression, as they called it in those days, and various psychological disturbances. And they actually looked at all the kind of medical notes of those composers. They looked at their personal journals, and then correlated and mapped that onto the proliferation of their periods of composition. And what they found was when someone was sort of, falling into a trough of a more depressed state, nothing was being produced, right? And they're, not particularly, feeling fulfilled or feeling happy and wanting to be on the planet.
Thank God that was the outcome. I was dreading that you were going to say the opposite.
This whole thing about the tortured artist thing, the myth of the glamorization of the tortured artist. But what happened was, as they started to rise up, and this is a natural cycle, as they started to come back up out of that lower state, that's when the proliferation happened, the composition happened, and then they reach the peak, and then they're euphoric, right? Everything's wonderful, and the applause is coming, and everybody loves what you're doing. And then the applause goes a little quiet, and you start to slide back down again. So it's, if you know that's what's coming, you develop tools to handle those lower times. But what I say to all artists is, don't try and get rid of those dark times. You can try and make them more tolerable, but they're the fertile soil for your next burst of creativity. But don't expect to be, necessarily producing there. And this is something, we've talked about before, is this myth of the tortured artist and almost the glamorization of that.
Yeah, I fucking hate it.
Yeah.
I absolutely hate it. And it, it also contributes to the internal conversation with an artist that, well, you know what, I'm not going to try that thing that I've heard might help me because I might lose my creativity, or I might lose my edge. Or if you're a comedian, you might not be as funny, or if you're fucking, whatever it is. It's just such a toxic mindset. This idea of the tortured artist, and well, that the idea being that the more tortured you are, the better the work. And it's like, it goes to the extent that something terrible happens in an artist's life, and then all the fans, not all the fans, a very unempathetic section of fans are like, well, there's going to be a great album that comes from this. I've seen that happen a lot, of that conversation. But it's not true. It's just a myth. The tortured artist is a myth. I mean, there are a lot of tortured artists, but the idea that they create the best work in that most tortured state is total bullshit. It's, usually they are their least fragmented in the beginning of their career, and then you hear all their best work, and then they fucking second, third album, they just don't know how to get it together anymore. And that's, you know, just so happens that that was the time that everything overwhelmed them. They became very depressed, overwhelmed, and just couldn't really figure it out anymore, and couldn't write, couldn't, you know, work with others, were too socially anxious to go into the studio, blah, blah, blah. And then you either see, you know, one of a few things happen. Sometimes they kill themselves. Sometimes they, you know, just disappear from music entirely and you never hear from them again. And sometimes they go to therapy or do something that changes their life or whatever, and they come out the other side and they start making even better music. And that's my goal for every artist, is to help them, and for myself, to come out of that place and find a healthy creative environment, you know, a creative output. And I have found that the more work I put into myself and the more self-care I applied, the more the kind of better my music became, and the more like myself my music became as well, because it's not uncommon for someone to, while they, you know, sit on stage and try and seem cool and whatever, you're also doing that on your albums. You know, you're doing that in your creative space as well. If you've got all those thoughts that are affecting you outside of the studio, it's probably true that you're masking in some way in the art itself. And when it comes to masking in art, it's important to remember that that is as a direct kind of, it's a direct correlation with how you are outside. So it's, you know, it's hard to be vulnerable in art. It's hard to say exactly what you mean in a lyric, for example. You know, you're talking about this time that your heart was broken. Are you really saying it? Or are you saying the soundbite version? Are you saying the version that you've heard someone else say before because it makes you feel like you can hide behind it? It's easier to say something that's cliche. It's also easier to say something that's just constructed in just poetically the right way to avoid the true vulnerability. Someone said to me something so fucking brilliant that I have repeated it ever since to basically everyone I meet. Her name's Monica Martin. She's an incredible singer-songwriter. And she said, we were talking about vulnerability in music and how there's a lot of, you know, songs that describe everything that's happening, right? In very much, you know, huge detail, but don't really make you feel anything. And she said, specificity does not equal vulnerability. And I found that so interesting. I mean, I know I've gone off on tangent in some creative thing here, but I think it comes back to how coherent we are as people is what enables us to go into our art and say the true, honest thing that helps us connect to people, that gives us the feedback that allows us to feel like it's worth doing. Most of us will have been on long runs of creative work that potentially aren't getting the reactions we're hoping for. And sometimes we don't see that it's with ourselves we've not been honest from the very start. And that all people are doing when they don't react well to your thing is picking up on that in a subtle way that they don't necessarily realize, and they might not have the vocabulary to tell you. And I think that's why this idea of balance can, when it's first kind of presented to you, sound like a, you know, we're in LA, there's a lot of wellness chat, you know, so we've probably all heard it, pretty much all of it, read all the books, it's, you know, talked about all the therapies and done all the, you know, all the different ways you can, but outside of, you know, when it's first presented to you, it can seem like an extension of something that seems like a buzzwords now. But I think what it truly does, and what you do, which was so instrumental in my recovery, I'll say, is guide you back to an authentic sense of self that allows you to just be honest in your own work. Because being honest in your own work is fucking scary. And being honest in your own work does actually make you feel better. Because it's a mirror of how you are able to be, hopefully, and you know, if you can't, then address the balance, because that's, I'd say, just as important to be able to do it outside of your work and in a room, you know, with people. But that's why I think what Jennie does is so important. Is it's holistically and kind of in a whole sense bringing somebody back to the sense of coherency that allows them to connect truly with what they do, which is life-changing, honestly, life-saving. I mean, if that's, you know, of help to anyone else listening, then I hope it is. So
just as we're coming to a close here before we take some questions, just something that another of our juicy topics recently. I've been studying for the last few years, sort of, because I like rabbit holes, unified physics and quantum biology, and
you know that kind of shit,
kind of stuff.
Books and
geometry, and all of it sort of, you know, brought to my attention this notion of 432 tuning, which you're going to have an experience of coming up just shortly. And so for those of you who don't know, all pitches in music, you know, the sort of scales in music, all the pitches are measured in hertz, which is cycles per second. And typically in the Western world, music is centered around 440 hertz as an A. So if you go hear an orchestra playing and they tune up at the beginning, it's to a 440 pitch A. For most orchestras, some use different tuning. Whereas historically it was really 432 as an A was how music was structured. A lot of the, you know, sort of earlier composers were all composing around that frequency. And when you start to look at that from a sacred geometry perspective, from a biological perspective and a cosmological perspective, so unified physics looks at the very small to the very large and unifies the language across them all, that there isn't sort of Newtonian physics that completely breaks down at the subatomic level. Nature's not that clumsy, right? There is a unified structure to it. And so when we look at 432 tuning, it is actually the music of the spheres, right? The planets, the way they are constructed is musical. Everything in the universe, as Tesla said, Nikola Tesla, that is energy, frequency, and vibration, right? And we are just vibration. We're not a thing. That's a subject for a whole other talk. There's no matter, right? We're just energy, frequency, vibration. And 432 is the basis for all this tuning. So just to give you a quick example of that, there are 43,200 seconds in a day and 43,200 seconds in a night, so 86,400 in a whole day. The moon is 2,160 miles in diameter. 216 is half of 432. The sun is 86,400 miles in diameter, which is twice 432. 432 squared equals the speed of light. It works, right? On all scales, it works. And when you look at the musical scale based around the A at 432, everything sums to 9. So this is called base 9 or root 9 maths. So 432, if you add those together, you get 9, right? 216, which is half of it. Add them together, you get 9. 864, get 18, which reduces to 9. And if you look at every musical note, the frequency in hertz across all octaves, lop off the zeros when you get into the thousands, all of them sum to 9. It's just magical. When you look at 440 hertz tuning and you put that on a grid of all the notes on the scale, there's no pattern, nothing. There's no relationship between the notes. So this is something I've been sort of getting quite deep into, and how when we hear 432, our body just, if anyone's heard it, and you will be hearing it later on, it's just like for me, it's truth. when I talked about truth and sense of self being a felt sense, when you feel it, you don't just hear it, right? It makes that noise. So I had this conversation with James, and he's like, "Ooh," and obviously he's doing a lot of electronic music. He's like, "How do I do that with like synths and electronic?" So what was that little rabbit hole?
Well, firstly, I mean, I've been making music for a long time in 440 and didn't see a problem at the time. But I also, was very open to the idea that there is a frequency, there's a way of tuning things that is more in line with my body, and there is a way of tuning things that, I mean, I was looking up studies in it, and basically the conclusion to all these studies was that 432 relaxed people in a much more profound way, and that at 440 people were left either not relaxed or even on edge with the same music, and recorded at 432 rather than just tuned down to 432 after recording as well, was an interesting kind of discrepancy. But anyway, so I did a few experiments. I actually for like a week just tuned my whole studio to, well, no, I tuned a few instruments, and then one thing I had this funny thing happen where I was using this. There's a thing called a Soma. It's by a company's called Soma. The instrument's called a Lyra, and it's basically just 8 oscillators, and they just are free tuning, so you can just tune it to whatever you want, right? And it's infinite tuning. Not A B C D E F. It's just free tuning, just like a violin. And I was playing just on this thing, and I got to the end. I was jamming on it for like 45 minutes. I was just in a zone. It's kind of like a drone instrument, so it just plays, infinitely. And I got to the end of it, and I was like, okay, I might just add some piano to this composition I've made. And I went to play the piano, and the piano was sharp. I was like, that's weird, because and then I just was curious. I thought, I wonder what I've naturally tuned this to without even thinking about anything. This is, by the way, this is before I've tuned my studio to it, and this is before I've even experimented with 432 at all. And it was tuned to exactly 432 hertz, and everything. Like, I was like, okay, well, that's just a fluke, right? So I kept doing it for like for the next couple of weeks, and every single time it was 432, and it was just funny because obviously you've been listening to other music all day, you've been whatever. You'd think you would automatically tune to 440 because that's what you've been listening to stuff on, but I didn't. I mean, maybe I'm I don't know how maybe my brain works differently, but it doesn't seem like it does, because a lot of other people seem to have that draw that conclusion. And I mean, this is speaking as someone who has zero knowledge, not just about that, but also about a lot of things. And
I wouldn't say that.
That really, that moment definitely struck me as very strange, and it got me interested. And so I've been experimenting more in the studio with that, and I've had some great results with it.
And I was just on a selfish level just going, I want to hear that voice in 432, and that'll be medicine it's already medicine, but
that's very sweet.
Art is nutrition, right? It carries nutritional value to those who it reaches, and when it's coming from that sense of self, and it's coming from that truth, it has a bandwidth of nutritional density. It's like if you have a piece of broccoli that's grown in good soil versus a piece of broccoli that's grown in not so good soil, it's reduced nutritional density, right? So that for me is when an artist is in their truth, is producing from that place. Artists are farmers. Tend your soil, and then everything you produce has high nutritional content for those it reaches.
That's right. And I was going to just quickly say that I think one thing I try and impress on artists that I work with, when I see them making decisions that would maybe underestimate their effect on other people and the world, is to say that it is such an important thing to create art and music, and to project, to take the hand you've been dealt and to convert it into whatever that hand is, to convert it into things that genuinely do help other people, heal other people, and make people, in ways that we might not be able to measure, or necessarily remunerate sometimes, or be able to put into statistics or streaming figures, whatever it is. You are all some kind of, very healthy 5G tower, without the 5G, of course, that's beaming your whatever it is your thing is, your resonance at people. And there'll be a lot of times where people are not on that frequency, and that's fine. But the fact that you're there doing it is very, very important.